here show up frequently, and it's always in relation to the temple. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. That verse is frequently attached to praise or worship taking place into the temple. So the temple is also associated with God's goodness. And both the temple and the promised land are associated, or I should say, pointing back to Eden. How is the temple pointing back to Eden? Do you know how the temple is decorated? It's decorated with trees and with fruit. And angels too, cherubim specifically, because who do we find at the garden after God kicked Adam and Eve out? We find cherubims. So the temple is literally calling right back to that original creation state when God created man and women. So all of those are associated with Eden, with God's goodness. But God's glory is also associated with God's goodness. Have you ever thought about that? God's glory is an expression of God's goodness. What do I mean? Well, God shows his glory through his good deeds, through his good actions, through his creation. God expresses his glory, but guess what? We give God glory for what he's done. So God shows his glory, and then we in turn give him glory for what he's done. That is what we do here in worship on Sunday mornings. That is what the story of our life should be, giving God glory for the good things that he has done. But guess what? God shared his glory with us. He created us to share his glory. What in the world am I talking about? Well, let me illustrate it. And I say illustrate, I mean literally illustrate it. What if I came to you with this drawing and I said, look, I drew a picture of you? Yeah, that's what you do. You laugh. But what if your little 4-year-old child or 4-year-old grandchild came up to you and said, look, I drew a picture of you. What do you think? Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness, it's wonderful. Let me hang it on the fridge. And tell me you wouldn't hang it on your fridge. What has that child done? I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. That child has just shown you their glory. They've drawn you a picture, and you've given them back glory for what they've done. You see how God shared his glory with us? And so think about it. Somebody performs a concert, or like today, play beautiful music. What do? We give them applause. And if it's really good, a standing ovation. If it's really good, encore, we shout, because we want more of it. That's them showing their glory and us giving them their glory. And you know what? Social media is all about that, isn't it? But then again, there's also our sports teams that we love. What do these guys do? They go out on the field of play and they show their glory, and we give them glory. Think about those man caves. You've heard of man caves, haven't you? Where guys have a little den or whatever, and it's just totally devoted to their sports team or whatever. That is man showing his glory and us giving glory in return. But what do we do with the God who created this? Or about the God who created this? And I'm going to be honest, the first time I walked out into the rim, south rim of the Grand Canyon, we walked down a path and it was covered. You couldn't see anything. And all of a sudden, blam, there was the Grand Canyon before me for the first time in my life. I cried. I was so overwhelmed with the magnitude of it. And all I could think of was the God of glory who created such a world for us to enjoy. And beautiful. What about that God who created all of this? So let's go back to that creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens. So imagine the heavens, a blue sphere of influence, let's call it. A sphere of influence. And at the top of that is God's throne. And God is ruling the kingdom of the heavens. But God also created the earth. And then lastly, he created us in his image. You see that tree there? That tree represents man's throne, because God created us In him is his image. What does that mean? Well, it tells us to rule as vice regents over this earth. We are stewards of this earth. But that tree represents the garden. Now imagine the earth. When God created in the second creation song in Genesis 2, we see that God created and the earth was barren. It was dry and brown, and nothing growing. And God created man. And then in the place called Eden, imagine this land called Eden, and in the middle of that country is a mountain or a hill. And at the top of that hill, God plants a garden. And we know what's in that garden. There's 3 things of importance in that garden. There's a man and his wife, there's a tree of life, and the tree of knowing good and bad. I put it that way because, well, evil is a specific kind of bad. Whereas bad is just, oops, it's bad. You know, if something's bad, it's rotten. If something's bad, it's not good. It's, in a sense, bad is in a very real sense the absence of good. But it's the tree of knowing good and bad. And God put Adam there with the expectation that he would trust God and choose the tree of giving life. But you see that word knowing, we could also say the tree of discerning good and bad, or, because how do you really know something without experiencing it, of experiencing good and bad. And God expected or hoped that Adam would choose life, not his own wisdom, but God's wisdom. And that's a theme we're going to see again. And by the way, I feel I have to do this before I can go further in the Lord's Prayer. This actually isn't about this. This is just the introduction. We'll get to the Lord's Prayer in the end, but you're going to see in the end how important this is. I've told you many times already that the first pages of Genesis are central, and we see the themes played out throughout the Bible. My intention today is to show you, give you a taste of how it all plays out. So that's where we're going with this. But God had tasked Adam with this little garden, not merely to tend the garden as we think, oh, we just need to take care of it where it is. No. Remember how the whole land was barren? God planted a garden. That imagery was that man would take that garden and grow it outwards and fill the whole earth with God's goodness by showing his own goodness. Do you see what I'm saying? Man's goodness would spread throughout the whole earth and thus show God's goodness. That was God's plan. Unfortunately, we kind of know how that ended. Man decided to choose his own wisdom. He decided, I want to taste this evil or this bad that's out there. So God created man, and then man fell. But also in those first pages of Genesis, we see in Genesis 3, when God tells the serpent, the snaky snake, the woman's seed is going to crush your seed. We already see an option, and actually in Genesis 5, or at the end of 4, Eve gives birth to her third son, Seth, and she names him Seth because she thinks that through his seed, or through him, God's going to crush the snake. So we already see the beginnings of the gospel story, but we see the story of redemption. So we have that arc of creation, fall, and redemption. And believe it or not, that story is going to play out multiple times through the Old Testament. Not necessarily the redemption part. We see creation, fall, repeating. God creates man, he fell. God created, the nation through Abraham, the children of Israel, and they blew it. Then God said, well, I'm going to choose David out of this kingdom. And then you think, wow, that's good. And actually with David and Solomon, it looks like things are going well, but then Solomon screws up, and then his sons screw up, and it just goes downhill from there. So you see multiple creation stories and multiple falls. But in the very middle of that story, Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham, the son of Adam, is born. And then in the middle of his story, you see the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. We see the gospel story, and eventually we'll see the return of Christ, but right in the middle is the cross. And I've only given you a small taste of that story arc just a tiniest taste because that's all we can do. But the cross is right in the middle. But Jesus is now the king. And he's begun rebuilding his kingdom. Theologians, we like to call that the already but not yet story. We are living in the part where it's already been fulfilled, but it's not yet come to fruition. We're living in this halfway state where the kingdom is there. It's in our hearts. It's here in this church. And it's growing, but it's not yet been completely and utterly fulfilled. And that's the story we are in right now. But speaking of that, let's go to the future. In Revelation chapter 4, there's a scene in the throne room in heaven where there's this little scroll with 7 seals. I believe that scroll represents the title deed of the earth. Others say, well, that's the Lamb's book of life with all those who've been redeemed written on it. And I say, yes, it's both of those. It's kind of like the title deed of all those who've been redeemed. Unfortunately, it's sealed with 7 seals, and there's nobody who's worthy to open it. But then the Lamb of God steps forward, and he takes it. And he's worthy to open. And this is where we read all the creatures around the throne singing, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to break its seals, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed us for God, ransomed for God, saints from every tribe, language, and people and nation."